Hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our fireside chat. Today, myself is Julian Weinberger, Field CTO of ShardSecure, and with me I have Zach Link. Zach, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, Zach Link, and I'm the CISO here at ShardSecure.
Great. So today we're going to discuss how AI data is really being attractive to espionage and ransomware groups. But I think we should probably take a step back and kind of see what really risks come with AI. So, Zach, obviously, you're the CISO here within our organization, so you are in charge of making sure that we are secure and we manage our risks. And AI is definitely something which has also popped up on your desk. So, first of all, I want to know how important has AI and machine learning really become to businesses?
Yeah, and I think 10 years ago, AI ML was really just sort of an emerging technology, but now it's really core to quite a few companies, and I see it especially in the security space, where some vendors AI is at the core of their business, and they wouldn't even exist without it. For other companies, it's just becoming more and more important every year.
Mm. So, since it becomes more and more important, right? I mean, we've seen it that people really make their money with AI, and it's the business value. So, what kind of risks are introduced and concerns are introduced with AI and machine learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the usual risks that you have, around data confidentiality still exist, right? If your training data includes, PII, PHI, any type of IP or other kind of sensitive data, you have to account for the confidentiality of that data. But in addition to that, you also have new risks that are totally unique to AI and ML, and that includes things like data poisoning, right? When an attacker tampers with your training data to bias or distort your model. There's also model stealing, right? So you spend millions of dollars on a model, on creating a model maybe, and if someone steals it, they can reverse engineer it for profit, so they can implement a model a lot cheaper that with all the money you paid for it, or they can also attack your models offline and find ways to bypass or subvert your model, right? There's also adversarial attacks, right? So that's maliciously altering the inputs to get a model that to have negative outcomes. So, like a good example of this would be some of the work they've done for fooling self-driving cars. Right? They place like tape on roads or on signs, and they make the driving model misinterpret the environment. There's also online system attacks, right? So this is for models that allow user feedback to fine tune the model. Attackers can input data to bias that system and affect the outcome. And then the last is like transfer learning risks. So you can kind of think of this similar to third-party risks, but if your company is implementing models from a third party, where you take a base model and then maybe you tune it on top of that, there's that risk if someone subverts that model that you're purchasing from another company, um, then you're going to be vulnerable to that type of attack too, right?
Mm. So it seems like different angles. I think one thing I heard is kind of like we spent millions on building a model. That's what you just said, and that's what I've heard from multiple other sources too, right? I mean, if you're in that space, it is very expensive. So every time we spend millions on creating something, whatever we create becomes an asset, right? So if should we consider really the models and the training data almost like as an intellectual property like we do with other things? Is that what we should do it from a risk point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Your data, both your models and your data are absolutely considered IP, right? A huge amount of money goes into gathering the data, processing the data, develop the models. You're paying for data scientists to work on this stuff. And hopefully these models give your company some type of unique advantage or a differentiator in what you do. Um, but you definitely have to treat that as IP.
Mm. So how much effort is really put into creating a data set? How do I get from random data on the internet or random data I gather somewhere to something which is really useful to an algorithm, right? How much effort
Yeah.
is really put into this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people really focus on models as far as AI and ML go. They focus on the models, but I've always heard the 80-20 rule for data scientists, which is 80% of the effort is processing your data to actually make it usable in the training and testing phases of AI and ML, and only 20% is the actual training of the model. So you have to take that raw data, and there's a huge amount of massaging and normalizing, you know, features, figuring out which features to use and stuff to actually be usable by your ML. So, I'm no data scientist, but I would expect that if someone had access to all that process data, the actual models are less and less relevant because they wouldn't be that hard to produce, right? So, everyone talks models, but the process data actually holds probably the bulk of the value of all of that process.
Yeah, I think the way you describe it and the way it's usually seen, the model is what you use within a product to get the benefits of an AI. But to get to the model, there's a lot of effort done, right? So
Yeah.
the way you described is like, okay, so if I have the data, that's kind of where the value is in. So the question now is, if this is a value to me as a data scientist, so me as an engineer, because I create a model out of it, can that be also in value to anyone else?
Yeah, 100%. I think back in 2006, there's a mathematician, Clive Humby, and he said, you probably recognize the quote, but data is the new oil. And I think a lot of people actually misinterpreted that, because what he meant is that in its raw form, data, like oil, wasn't really particularly useful. But when you transformed it had this amazing potential, right? So oil can be used to create, gas and plastics and fertilizer and all sorts of other things. But you don't go out to the store and buy a barrel of oil and bring it home, right? The same goes for data. In its raw form, you can have petabytes of data in a data lake somewhere, but if you actually haven't processed it doesn't have a huge amount of value to it. But once you actually do process it, you can create models from that. The benefits are exponential from a value standpoint, right? So yeah, I mean, I think Clive Humby said that quote, "Data's new oil," like 20 years ago, and I think it still stands, and I think it's actually still stands more so, even more so than it did 20 years ago.
Mhm. So for most of us in security, and I myself been data security for a while, and data is data. But if you're in security, there's sometimes, data science takes a different approach where the stuff lives, and as a security professionals, you never really get exposed to it. So can you shed some light on kind of like where those, as you said, the training sets live, and how they're currently protected?
Yeah, and I don't know what every company does or anything, but my guess is that most companies store all their training data in the cloud, right? Like in object stores, data lakes, something like that, because cloud is where you have access to essentially unlimited storage. You've got AI and ML tools there that the platforms provide from all the different cloud vendors, and then you've got very scalable compute that you can spin up and do all your training. So I assume it's all cloud based. Maybe some large companies have some stuff on prem, but how are they protected? Honestly, most of the security groups that I've talked to, they just treat training data and models just like normal data, right? Meaning whatever sensitivity it has is based on the data in the files itself. But as I mentioned before, the risks with AI/ML they're very different, and the value of the data models are very different because of the huge value add and resources that you've put in to process the data, training the models, creating the models, which takes time, resources, a huge amount of expertise, and essentially money, over and above just collecting all that raw data.
Mm. That's interesting. I think now I'm very curious about the last two things you said. So one of them is like, okay, the data set itself lives within the cloud, so it lives in a third party, and it's in there where people can leverage it, and engineers. But then my own data set might also be valuable to someone else who trains their other data set, right? So sometimes that overlaps. So um, what I think from a risk point of view, so we've seen that, for example, in the example of Git, where they did train their data on public available, basically public available code in GitHub, which is a concern. Is there in general, um, like, does my training data set become valuable to the cloud provider? Is that a thing? Do I need to be concerned not only about, you know, unauthorized third party access, but then also, like, if I put my data into a third party, do they can actually leverage the data to improve their own algorithms?
Yeah, and there's probably legal aspects of that as well. But you absolutely need data to create models, right? And a lot of people don't have access to that data. That's really sort of one of the sort of gatekeepers of creating, AI models, right? So everyone that's building models, they need to find that data, and if they don't have it, themselves, they're going to look for it elsewhere. Like, there's a lot of stuff that's just scraping the public internet, but that's not that's all very raw data. It's not actually great for AI. So, I mean, as you put your data in the cloud, I think that you have to acknowledge the risk that provides a lot of value for other companies. And if um, you're starting to put in other companies' platforms, then there's definitely an associated risk with that.
How do I think that's very interesting, because especially every time we talk to IP and IP living in a third party, it becomes kind of concerning from a risk point of view, right?
Hmm.
There's people who can't sleep at night, and I'm probably one of them. Um, so what can I really do if my cloud provider is my competitor for some reason?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it earlier, like with the GitHub Copilot situation, right? And that's an ongoing lawsuit right now. But I think when a lot of developers started putting projects up on GitHub, I don't think they were expecting those code repositories that they have copyright on, um, to be used for someone else's training someone else's ML models, right? um, and then for their copyrighted code to come back to be sort of reproduced, so to speak. I'm going to use some air quotes here, but the code that they wrote actually comes up as suggestions as part of Copilot. Um, so that, I mean, that's very public. I think the Copilot thing, but it is not hard to imagine that your data in a cloud environment, or in all these different platforms or SaaS services, could make its way into another company's product without anyone even knowing, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's probably more common in free kind of options. I think you're the one who told me once, if you don't pay for the product, you are the product.
100%, right?
So that applies exactly.
That's
Yeah.
always been true.
So that's interesting. So we covered a lot about the data it takes to create a model and how we can secure this and what the issues are, which sounds like, I've been in data security a while. It's data in the end of the day, so you need to protect it. And if it's sensitive to someone else, there's interest. What about the models? How are models protected, and are they even useful to an attacker?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the data is one side of that coin, but the models are the other side. So, if I'm an attacker and I can steal your model, it's only one step for me to take that offline and attack it. So, like, instead of attacking your live system where you've got detection and logging and probably your SOC guys monitoring your systems, if I can take that model and pull it back to my evil.com lab or whatever, and just start running attacks on it directly on that model. Maybe I'm even using ML to do that, which is really it's like offensive AI. Then that's a real issue, right? So let's say you're a bank and you have a model to detect wire fraud, wire transfer fraud, right? As an attacker, if I steal that model, bring it back to my lab, run some ML on it, I might be able to pinpoint certain fraud techniques that are false negatives in your production model, meaning that they wouldn't be detected, right? And so after I perfect that as an attacker in my lab, then I can actually find those vulnerabilities and do real live attacks on your bank that you would totally miss. Like I could see that would be a huge advantage for a crime organization. Uh, yeah, and then another type of attack is really just to reverse engineer it, right? So you've put all this time and money into creating these models, and if I could steal your model, um, even not knowing all the data that went into it, I can just start putting inputs into it and see what the outputs are, and I can effectively copy or reverse engineer that model and have like essentially a super cheap lookalike model that I took all your energy and effort that you did to create it, and I've just reversed it probably on my laptop, and I could have a working model, right? So that's another possibility.
I think what's very interesting there is you said like model theft, right? Which is basically the extraction of the model, which is usually lives in some kind of file. But then we also talked about the data sets, which mostly live in, it's large data sets, large data repositories. And every time I hear this kind of the files, large data repositories over the last couple of years, the number one concern, at least in the past, was ransomware. So ransomware coming in, large data sets, they can extract my data, get in, as well as lock me out. So how about ransomware and AI? How does it overlap? Is it a concern? What's going on in the ransomware space?
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, like ransomware, it's something I think everyone is tired of hearing about, but it's not really going anywhere. So it is still a significant risk, and even if your data is fully backed up, and it gets ransomed, and you can restore like these petabytes of data and stuff like that, you still lost it temporarily. Maybe some of this data, maybe you're not backing up these huge data lakes and stuff like that, in which case you would have lost the data. But either way, it would have a significant impact to your organization, or it could anyway. And even losing access to it for temporary could disrupt your whole pipeline and release schedules and stuff like that for your models. So yeah, definitely significant.
Yeah. So long story short, I guess all our common risks and concerns still apply to AI. They don't really go away. It's just a different.
Exactly.
So so we
Exactly.
talked a lot about the data in the back and as well as the model, so the training data as well as the model. So what can we do, and obviously me and you are as well in the data security business with ShardSecure. I mean, how do you protect sensitive data, especially business critical data like intellectual property or AI and ML? Like, can you shed a little bit of light on this, how you basically mitigate the risk in this space?
Yeah. So we use, obviously you need a layered approach, but for all of our data at rest, we actually use the ShardSecure platform ourselves internally. So this really gives more comprehensive security, like over and above something like encryption, right? So we cover the whole CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So encryption might help you out to keep that data safe at rest. Our platform, what that does for us is over and above securing that data at rest, we also do integrity checks on all that data, so we can actually detect if that data has been poisoned, like tampered with, if it's been corrupted, if maybe it's been ransomed by ransomware. And then we take it a step further with those integrity checks. We actually have a self-healing feature. What that means is once we've detected that something has altered that data in some way, then we can actually restore that data in real time and automatically back to its original form. So whether you're talking about things like training data, whether you're talking about models, all that stuff that sits at rest, we've got a whole platform of coverage to ensure that that data is secure. It's not going to leak out. Someone's not going to steal it, B, it has full integrity, and we're maintaining that, byte for byte. And three, it's resilient and available for us as well, so that we have less impact during the things that the things that go on, every week, right?
Mhm.
So
I mean, it's probably good to hear to any of our customers and prospects that we do eat our own dog food, and our own CISO is actually leveraging our own tools.
or
So,
drink our own champagne, as
yeah,
they
there you
say.
go. It's champagne, I guess, at that point. But it's definitely interesting to see that you know uh, the same approach can be applied to any kind of business critical data. But I think one thing I want to come back to, because sometimes in our industry we tend to reinvent the wheel if it's not necessary. So for the state in which we are in the AI ML world and the data and the models, is it really the protection of the data and the models? Is it really that different from any other protection of sensitive data?
Uh, Yeah, and I think I kind of mentioned it earlier. The risks are actually different. So if we take the idea of data is the new oil, the fact that you have spent so much time and money and resources to actually transform that data and train your models, and then you've got those additional risks. I think that you have to treat it differently.
Mm. So I mean, I think we as an industry will learn where this is going, but definitely it becomes something to need to be protected and have to have an eye on it. Um, Something totally different I want to mention. Every time in a security space we talk around data, there's the security part and there's the compliance part. So let's dive a little bit into the privacy angle on where this all falls in. So we've seen over the last couple months different countries trying to get different jurisdictions and compliances in for AI. I guess we'll see how this is going to turn out, and if we need to be compliant to AI, and what really is. But in the current state of our privacy and regulations around the globe, like how does AI and ML kind of fall into the privacy angle there, especially around the data?
Yeah, I mean, certainly if there's any, personal data in your training data, obviously that's going to fall under privacy regulations. And I think everyone thinks of like GDPR to start out, but those privacy regulations are spreading, right? Brazil's had one for years, California's had one for years. I think a lot of U.S. states are starting to adopt them. I think there was like 4 states, I think, have adopted them this year that should go into effect, and there's more being considered. Other states are considering them next year. So the privacy regulation is going to be ongoing. So obviously, if you have personal data in your training data, that's there. But your models too, there's a risk of leaking stuff through your models. Like if you are using a model that has like a small sample set. I don't know, maybe you've got like health data, and you're running this model in a clinic, and they have 5 patients that day or something like that. It's quite possible that someone could reverse some of the outputs and infer who those people are, and actually be able to track this anonymized data back to who it was or something like that. And so there's an additional risk, I think, also of what the model knows, right? Or some models, they call them, call overfitting a model, is when a model sort of memorizes the data that it's trained on. That if your model is overfit, it can definitely release personal data as well. So
That,
things to
that
worry about.
that's interesting. So the idea basically is if I have a model and I would ask it, for example, um, I mean, show me Cycling's health records, even if the model doesn't have it, it would display it back, right? So
Right.
very, very
Right.
interesting. So something which which I've experienced a lot is that every time we talk about personal data and we talk about the cloud, which basically AI and machine learning totally fits into, um, we see hurdles in the adoption, especially over in Europe. People are just more concerned around moving to the cloud, and there are some regulations which make it really hard to put European data into an American cloud provider.
Yeah.
So, does the entire GDPR issue also apply for the AI world?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's quite possible. If you train a model on private data, that's under some sort of jurisdiction, like where that model is trained and the data that is used to train it, I think applies to the model itself, right? Um, uh, just because it's based on that data. So it's probably a little bit of a uh, I don't think it's been fully fleshed out, but there's
Mhm.
definitely going to be some legal issues around that and privacy issues, around sovereignty of those models.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the privacy sector, a lot of moving pieces, and we're obviously in the front of this, so it's always good to see. We'll all stay tuned and see what comes down the pipeline.
Yeah,
But data has been the number one focus of privacy. So if data is the number one focus of AI, that's going to overlap, and regulators will be right there.
yeah.
That's not a problem. So I want to switch some things to the opposite side. So we talked about AI as business benefits, and there's some risk to it. But every time I've seen new technologies coming up, I worked in cloud computing. Then cloud computing was used to scale very fast, and DDoS
Uh,
attackers figured it out that you can scale very fast too. Then I worked in encryption, and encryption is hiding the stuff from the bad guys. Then the bad guys figured out you can also use it to lock someone else out. So every time we find something good, someone takes it and hits someone else over the head. So where is the dark end of AI? Can I also become basically a tool for cyber attacks?
yeah, I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but there's definitely a lot on offensive AI, right? This is the offensive AI isn't new, right? The attackers are already using it, but it doesn't require AI to attack AI, but it sure sure makes your life easier, right? And there's certain situations that can make offensive AI, the obvious choice of attack, right? So, for example, if I can steal your model and attack it offline, like that's a prime example where I'm going to attack it with my own AI and just iterate over it and whether I'm trying to reverse engineer it, find vulnerabilities in it, or whatever I'm doing, I'm probably going to use AI to do that. And if you can take something offline, right, there's no limiting factors, right? You don't have rate caps, you don't have fees and logged in accounts and detection mechanisms, things like that. So if I can take your model offline and attack it, I'm totally using ML to do it because I could iterate a million times on it and you would never know, right?
Mm, definitely. So my takeaway always coming up, almost coming up on time. So my key takeaway is like there's different angles to AI which you need to be concerned from a risk point of view, right? There's the data angle. The data sets are highly valuable to, well, the bad guys and espionage. So anyone who wants to do any kind of harm or see value in it. So that's my first takeaway. And the models need to be protected by model theft as well. Since that's a heavy data focused domain, so we are under the privacy umbrella and whatever new privacy regulations are coming out, which is always interesting to see, and we'll see how we move forward. But I think the best practices for protecting data still applies, so that's very good to know. If any of our listeners is interested, we have an attachment to our session here. We have a white paper on what ShardSecure is doing to protect the training data as well as the model, and can help you really protect your own AI and ML environment. And we can help there as well. Don't be shy. If you have any questions, reach out to us. You can either talk to me on more on the technology side, or if you want to hear from our own CISO, you can always reach out to Zach as well, and he can give you his point of view on how he actually mitigates the risk of our organization. I think we can close the session for today. That was great. Zach, thank you for joining, and
Thanks,
we'll see
Julian.
you next time.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining.